A little girl told a giant of a man a secret that would shatter their town's fragile peace, but it all began with a simple, desperate act of honesty. She returned a lost wallet containing $3,000 to a man who looked like he could break the world in two, and in doing so, handed him the key to her cage. What he would later find in her tattered backpack was not just the story of her suffering, but the evidence that would bring a monster to justice and summon a legion of leather-clad angels to her side. The diner smelled of stale coffee and regret. It was a smell he knew well. Bear sat in a corner booth, the red vinyl cracked and groaning under his weight. He was a mountain of a man, clad in worn leather and denim, his arms a roadmap of faded ink and old scars. His real name was Arthur, but no one had called him that in 20 years, not since the accident. Now he was just Bear, president of the Iron Sentinels Motorcycle Club, a name that meant something different to everyone who heard it. To some, it was a threat. To others, a promise. He nursed the black coffee, the ceramic mug looking like a child's toy in his massive hand. He was just passing through this sleepy, forgettable town, a pit stop on his way to a regional meeting. He preferred the anonymity of places like this, places where people saw the vest, the beard, the sheer size of him, and left him alone with his thoughts. His thoughts were ghosts, as they often were. A little girl's laugh, the scent of lavender soap, a small hand in his, memories that were sharp enough to cut. He pushed them away, focusing on the hum of the diner, the clatter of cutlery, the low murmur of conversation. Then he saw her. She was a ghost herself, slipping through the spaces between the tables. A small thing, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with eyes that were far too old for her face. Her hair was a tangled mat of brown. Her coat was thin and frayed, and her sneakers had holes in the toes despite the autumn chill outside. She moved with a practiced invisibility, a skill learned by those who need to survive without being noticed. She wasn't begging. She wasn't making a scene. She was just watching. Her gaze swept the room, not with the curiosity of a child, but with the calculating assessment of a scavenger. She noted the half-eaten plate of fries on a table just being vacated, the sugar packets left near the counter. Her eyes landed on him, and for a second, they held. He didn't smile, didn't beckon. He just looked, his own gaze steady and unreadable. He saw a flicker of something in her expression. Not fear of him, not exactly. It was a deeper, more ingrained fear of everything. The world was a place of sharp edges, and she was learning to navigate them without bleeding. She looked away first, her attention drawn to a family in the next booth. A mother, a father, a little boy complaining loudly about his pancakes. The mother sighed, exasperated but fond. The father ruffled the boy's hair. It was a simple, mundane scene of domestic life. For the little girl, it seemed to be a broadcast from another planet. She watched with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Bear watched her watch them. He saw the subtle shift in her posture, the way her shoulders slumped just a little more. She was a ship with no harbor, drifting in a sea of families. A teacher at a nearby table, grading papers with a red pen, glanced up at the girl, her lips thinning into a line of disapproval, before she pointedly returned to her work. A pair of businessmen laughed, oblivious. The waitress, a tired-looking woman named Brenda, according to her name tag, bustled past, her focus on refilling coffee cups and clearing plates, too overworked to notice the small shadow lingering by the door. This was how it happened. This was how children fell through the cracks. Not with a crash, but with a quiet, collective turning away. Bear felt a low growl build in his chest, an old and familiar anger. He took a slow sip of his coffee to tamp it down. It wasn't his fight. This wasn't his town. He motioned for his check. Brenda brought it over, her eyes carefully avoiding his. He laid a few bills on the table, more than enough to cover the coffee. He stood, his large frame casting a long shadow over the booth. As he slid out, his thick leather wallet, heavy with the cash he was carrying for club business, slipped from his back pocket. It hit the linoleum floor with a soft, dull thud. He didn't notice. His mind was already on the road, on the miles ahead. He walked toward the exit, his boots making heavy, solid sounds on the worn floor. He was halfway through the door when he heard it. A small voice, thin as a thread. "Mister?" He stopped, turning slowly. The little girl was standing there, holding his wallet in her two small hands. It looked enormous, a black brick of leather that seemed to weigh her down. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her face pale. He looked from the wallet back to her. He hadn't even realized it was gone. "You dropped this," she whispered, holding it out to him. He walked back to her, each step deliberate. He knelt, a difficult and creaking process for a man his size, to bring himself down to her level. The diner seemed to hold its breath. Everyone was watching now. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rumble. He took the wallet from her. He could feel the warmth of her hands still on the leather. He opened it. The cash was all there. $3,000, neatly stacked. A fortune to anyone, but to a child this destitute, it must have seemed like a king's ransom. She could have taken it. She could have vanished out the door and he would have been none the wiser for miles. She could have taken 100 and he might not have noticed. But she hadn't. She had brought it back. All of it. He looked into her eyes, really looked this time. He saw the exhaustion, the hunger, the bone-deep weariness. But beneath it all, he saw a spine of steel, an integrity that had not yet been broken. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "Lily," she breathed. "Lily," he repeated. The name was a flower, fragile and beautiful. It didn't fit the grime on her face or the fear in her eyes. "You hungry, Lily?" She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It was a lie. Her stomach had been growling so loudly he could practically hear it from the booth. It was the reflexive denial of someone who had learned not to ask for anything, not to expect anything. "I am," he said simply, "and I don't like to eat alone." He didn't ask again. He simply stood, took her small, cold hand in his massive, calloused one, and led her back to his booth. He felt her flinch at his touch, a tremor of fear, but she didn't pull away. It was as if she was too tired to fight. He slid back into the vinyl seat, and she followed, perching on the very edge of the bench opposite him, as if ready to bolt at a moment's notice. She clutched a small, dirty backpack to her chest like a shield. Brenda, the waitress, came over, her expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "We'll have 2 orders of the pancakes with extra bacon," Bear said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "and 2 hot chocolates, with whipped cream." Brenda just nodded and hurried away. They sat in silence for a moment. Lily kept her eyes down, focused on a crack in the Formica tabletop. "That was a good thing you did," Bear said. She didn't respond. A lot of people wouldn't have done that. Still nothing. Her silence wasn't sullen or defiant. It was a wall, built brick by brick out of neglect and fear. He knew he couldn't force his way through it. He would have to wait for her to open the gate. The food arrived, 2 steaming plates of pancakes, a side of sizzling bacon, and 2 large mugs of hot chocolate piled high with whipped cream. The smell was rich and warm. Lily stared at the plate in front of her as if it were a bomb. Her eyes were wide, her hands clenched in her lap. "Go on," Bear said gently. "It's yours." Slowly, hesitantly, she picked up her fork. Her movements were stiff, uncertain. She cut a small piece of pancake, soaked it in syrup, and brought it to her mouth. She chewed, her eyes closing for a fraction of a second. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated relief. She began to eat, not ravenously, but with a quiet, desperate intensity. She ate as if she was afraid the food would be taken away. Bear didn't say a word. He just ate his own meal, creating a space of normalcy for her, a small pocket of safety in a hostile world. He watched her as she ate. He noticed the faded bruise on her cheekbone, shaped vaguely like a thumbprint. He saw the way she angled her body as if to protect her ribs. He saw the slight limp when she had walked toward him. These were not the scrapes and bumps of a normal childhood. They were signs, a language he knew how to read all too well. When she was finished, every last crumb gone from her plate, she drank the hot chocolate, leaving a milky mustache on her upper lip. A small, almost imperceptible sigh of contentment escaped her. "Better?" Bear asked. She nodded, her eyes finally meeting his for more than a second. They were a deep, clear blue, like a winter sky, and in their depths, he saw the storm. "Where are your folks, Lily?" he asked, keeping his voice low and even. Her face shuddered immediately. The wall went back up, higher and thicker than before. Don't have any, she mumbled. Who do you live with? Mr. Thorne. The name was a stone in her mouth. Is he your guardian? She nodded, her gaze dropping back to the table. She began to trace the crack in the formica with her finger. Does Mr. Thorne take good care of you? Bear asked. The question was a key, turning slowly in a rusted lock. Tears welled in her eyes, silent and hot. They traced clean paths down her dirty cheeks. She shook her head, a violent, jerky motion. No, she whispered. The word was fragile as thin ice. Does he hurt you? She flinched, pulling in on herself, her arms wrapping around her backpack again. She didn't answer, but her silence was an answer in itself. Did you try to tell anyone? Bear pressed, his voice still quiet, but now with an edge of steel. She nodded. Told my teacher. She called Mr. Thorne. He said I was a liar. He said I make up stories for attention. Her voice was flat, reciting a script she had been forced to learn. He smiled when he said it. The image was chilling. A man in a position of trust, a pillar of the community, smiling as he condemned a child to her private hell. He's respected, Lily continued, the word sounding alien on her lips. He works for the county, helps kids. Everyone thinks he's a saint. The failed system. Bear had seen it 100 times. The overworked teacher, the deceived official, the predator hiding in plain sight, protected by a veneer of respectability. I tried to tell a policeman once, she added, her voice barely audible. He was getting coffee. He said I should go home. He said Mr. Thorne was a good man, that he'd just seen him at the town fundraiser. Bear's jaw tightened. The anger was back, no longer a low growl, but a cold, hard knot in his gut. He had a sudden, violent urge to find this Mr. Thorne and dismantle him piece by piece. But he knew that wasn't the answer. Brute force would only get him thrown in jail and Lily thrown back into the fire. This required something else. It required strategy. It required his brothers. Lily, he said, his voice now a solemn vow, I believe you. Her head snapped up, her blue eyes, wide and swimming with tears, locked onto his. It was a look of profound, desperate hope, the look of a drowning person who has just been thrown a line. You're safe now, he said. It wasn't a platitude, it was a promise, an unbreakable oath sworn in a cheap diner over cold pancakes. I'm not leaving. We're going to handle this. She just stared at him, her small body trembling. She didn't know who he was. She only knew that for the first time, someone had listened. Someone had believed. What's in the backpack? He asked gently, nodding toward the bag she clutched like a lifeline. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door as if expecting the devil himself to walk in. It's okay, Bear reassured her. You can show me. With trembling fingers, she unzipped the main compartment. It wasn't filled with school books or toys. It was meticulously packed. On top was a worn, stuffed bear with one button eye, its fur loved away in patches. Beneath that, a change of clothes, neatly folded, and at the bottom, a large waterproof manila envelope. She pulled it out and slid it across the table to him. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely let go. Bear opened the clasp. Inside were papers. Not children's drawings, but official documents. He pulled them out, his eyes scanning the first page. It was a copy of a life insurance policy, taken out on Lily's parents, who had died in a car crash a year ago. The beneficiary was not Lily, but a trust managed by her legal guardian, Marcus Thorne. The payout was substantial, $500,000. The next document was a medical report. It detailed a series of accidents Lily had suffered. A fall down the stairs, a burn from a kitchen mishap. Each one was signed off by a Dr. Miller, with a note stating that the child was prone to clumsiness. Then there were letters. Copies of letters sent to a woman named Eleanor Vance, Lily's maternal grandmother. The letters from Thorne were full of smooth, professional prose, explaining that Lily was adjusting well but still very fragile, and that it was best for her emotional stability not to have visitors for the time being. He claimed the grandmother's own letters were upsetting the child. The last thing in the envelope was a small, spiral-bound notebook, a child's diary. Bear opened it. The handwriting was messy, the spelling imperfect, but the words were a gut punch. October 3rd. Mr. Thorne was mad today. He said I cost too much money. My arm hurts. October 10th. He told me Grandma Eleanor doesn't want to see me anymore. He said she was sick of me. I don't believe him. October 15th. I fell again. He said if I tell anyone, he will send me to a bad place. A place with no windows. Pain lightninged through Bear's chest, sharp and cold. It was the pain of his own loss, his own failure to protect. He had lost his own daughter, Sarah, to a drunk driver. He knew the shape of the hole that grief leaves in a man's soul. He had sworn then that he would never stand by and let another child suffer if he could do something to stop it. He carefully placed the documents back in the envelope. This wasn't just a child's story. This was a case. This was evidence. Lily hadn't just been surviving. She had been fighting. She had been gathering proof. A small, terrified soldier collecting intelligence from behind enemy lines. He looked at her, and his heart ached with a fierce, protective love. This small, broken child had more courage than any 10 men he knew. He slid his phone out of his pocket. He had one call to make. He scrolled through his contacts to a name listed only as Saint. He pressed the button. It was answered on the first ring. "Talk to me," a calm, steady voice said on the other end. "Saint, it's Bear." "I know. What's your 20? "A town called Harmony Creek, off Route 32. There was a pause. "You're not supposed to be there for another day." "Change of plans," Bear said, his eyes never leaving Lily's face. "I have a situation. A code cub." The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and absolute. Code Cub was the highest priority alert the Iron Sentinels had. It meant a child was in danger. It was the one call that superseded everything else. It was the reason the club existed, the core of their unwritten code. They were not thugs or outlaws. They were protectors. They were the wall that stands between the wolves and the lambs. "How many?" Saint's voice was now clipped, all business. "One. A girl. Name's Lily." "What's the threat level?" "High. Predator is a respected local. Guardian. Systems failed her." Bear's voice was low, laced with cold fury. "He's hiding in plain sight." "Evidence?" "I'm holding it in my hand." "Understood," Saint said. "I'm making the call." The nearest chapters are Black Ridge and Stone Valley. ETA 90 minutes. I'm rolling from HQ. ETA 3 hours. Sit tight. Do not engage. Secure the cub. Is she with you? "She's with me," Bear confirmed. "Good. We're coming," Saint said. "The thunder is coming." The line went dead. Bear put his phone away. He looked at Lily, who had been watching the exchange with wide, questioning eyes. "Who was that?" she whispered. "A friend," Bear said. "Help is on the way." For the next 90 minutes, they just sat. Bear ordered Lily another hot chocolate. He didn't ask her any more questions, didn't push her to talk. He just provided a silent, solid presence, a wall that doesn't move. He was her anchor in the storm, and he would not let her be swept away. He thought about the man named Thorne, and the cold anger inside him began to burn. It was a clean, righteous fire. He knew what men like Thorne were. They were cowards who fed on the weak, parasites who cloaked themselves in decency, and Bear knew, with an absolute certainty, that he was going to burn that cloak to ashes. He thought about the club, the men who were, at that very moment, dropping everything, kissing their wives and kids goodbye, leaving jobs, walking out of bars. They were throwing on their cuts, straddling thousands of pounds of American steel, and riding. Not for money, not for glory, but because a brother had called, and a cub was in danger. They were a family, bound by loyalty and a shared code. And their code was simple. You do not harm a child. Not on their watch. The first sign of their arrival was not a sound, but a vibration. A low, deep hum that resonated through the floor of the diner, making the coffee in their mugs tremble. Lily looked up, her eyes wide with alarm. "It's okay," Bear said, his hand resting on the table near hers. "It's them." The hum grew into a rumble, then a roar, a sound like approaching thunder on a clear day. Heads in the diner turned toward the windows. Brenda, the waitress, froze mid-step. a coffee pot in her hand. Outside, a river of headlights flooded the parking lot. One by one, then in twos and threes, motorcycles pulled in. Large, powerful machines, gleaming chrome and dark paint. The men riding them were cut from the same cloth as Bear. Large, bearded, clad in the leather and denim uniform of their tribe. On the back of each vest was the same patch, a roaring bear's head inside a circle of iron chain. The Iron Sentinels. They didn't park haphazardly. They arranged their bikes in neat, disciplined rows, a silent testament to their organization. They killed their engines, and the sudden silence was more profound than the noise had been. The door of the diner opened, and a man walked in. He was older than Bear, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and eyes that held a calm, commanding authority. This was Saint, the club's national president. He was flanked by two other men, their faces grim and set. Saint's eyes scanned the room, instantly finding Bear in the corner booth. He walked over, his boots silent on the floor. He ignored the gaping stares of the other patrons. His focus was entirely on the mission. He stopped at their table. He looked at Bear, a nod of acknowledgement. Then his gaze fell on Lily. His hard expression softened instantly. He saw not a problem to be solved, but a child to be saved. "Bear," he said quietly. "Saint," Bear replied. He gestured to Lily. "This is Lily." Saint crouched down just as Bear had done. His leather creaked. "Hello, Lily," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "My name is John. It's a pleasure to meet you. I hear you're very brave." Lily stared at him, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of these large, intimidating men. She shrank back against the vinyl seat. Bear put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, kid. These are my friends. They're here to help." Saint didn't press her. He stood up and turned his attention back to Bear. "Report." Bear slid the manila envelope across the table. "It's all in there. Insurance fraud, medical neglect, emotional abuse, a pattern. The target is a man named Marcus Thorne, county social worker, her legal guardian." Saint took the envelope and handed it to one of the men behind him, a man with a laptop bag slung over his shoulder and a patch on his vest that read, "Ghost." "Ghost, get on this. I want a full digital workup on Thorne. Financials, communications, property records, everything. Cross-reference the doctor, Miller." Ghost nodded. "Already on it." He tapped a few keys on a tablet he produced from his bag. Saint turned to the other man, who wore a patch that said Doc. "Doc, you'll be with the girl. She needs a full, private medical evaluation as soon as we secure her. Look for signs of long-term malnutrition, untreated injuries. Document everything." Doc, a former Army medic with steady hands and kind eyes, just nodded. "Understood." "All right," Saint said, his voice dropping to a low command that cut through the diner's stunned silence. "We have a location on Thorne?" "Not yet," Ghost said, his fingers flying across the screen. "But I will. Give me 5 minutes." "Good," Saint said. He looked around the diner, his gaze finally settling on the other patrons. They looked away, suddenly finding their plates or the sugar dispensers intensely interesting. His eyes lingered on the teacher and the waitress. Witnesses. "We establish a perimeter," Saint said to Bear. "Silent containment. No contact, no engagement. We are a wall. We don't let him leave. We don't let him destroy evidence. We wait for the local law to do their job." He paused. "And if they won't, we will respectfully persuade them." The unspoken meaning was clear. The Iron Sentinels would not break the law, but they would bend it to its breaking point to protect a child. They would create a situation so public, so undeniable, that the authorities would have no choice but to act. "Got him," Ghost announced quietly. "Address is 124 Willow Creek Lane. Picket fence, 2-story colonial. The picture of suburban bliss." The disgust in his voice was palpable. "Preacher," Saint called out toward the door. Another man entered, this one leaner, with the sharp, intelligent face of a lawyer, which he had been before he'd traded his suit for a leather cut. "You're on liaison. Get the local sheriff on the phone. Inform him, very politely, that a concerned citizens group is holding a peaceful vigil outside the home of a suspected child abuser. Let him know we have credible evidence, and we are here to ensure the safety of a minor until an official investigation can be commenced." Preacher smiled, a thin, cold smile. It would be my pleasure. The rest of you, Saint said, his voice just loud enough for all his men in the parking lot to hear. Mount up. We ride. The plan was set. A precise, multi-pronged operation, executed with military discipline. This was not a chaotic mob. This was a scalpel, preparing to excise a cancer from the heart of this town. Bear turned to Lily. We have to go now. We're going to get you somewhere safe. He helped her out of the booth. Doc came forward, holding a warm blanket. He wrapped it gently around her shoulders. Brenda, Bear called out to the waitress, who was still standing frozen by the coffee machine. She jumped. Yes? Bear walked over to her. He laid a $100 bill on the counter. For the food, and for your trouble. He leaned in closer. The police might have some questions for you later, about seeing Lily in here, about who she was with. Brenda looked from Bear to Lily, who was now huddled under the blanket, surrounded by a circle of leather-clad giants. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by a flush of shame for her earlier indifference. She was an awakened bystander. She comes in sometimes, Brenda said, her voice quiet but firm. Always alone, always looks hungry. I saw the bruise on her face. I should have done something. You can do something now, Bear said. Tell the truth. Brenda nodded, her jaw set with new resolve. I will. Bear nodded once, then turned and guided Lily out of the diner. The cool night air hit them. The iron sentinels were already mounted on their bikes, engines rumbling in a low, synchronized idle. They formed two columns, creating a clear path for Bear, Lily, and the command group. It was a corridor of protection, a gauntlet of chrome and steel. Doc opened the door to a large black SUV that had pulled up behind the bikes. You'll ride in here with me, Lily, he said gently. It's warm. Lily looked up at Bear, her eyes full of uncertainty. I'll be right behind you, Bear promised. I'm not going anywhere. She nodded and allowed Doc to help her into the back seat. Bear watched the door close, then walked to his own bike, a massive, powerful machine that seemed an extension of his own formidable presence. He swung a leg over, settled into the seat, and fired the engine. The roar was a promise of retribution. Saint gave a single, sharp hand signal. In perfect unison, the column of bikes pulled out of the parking lot, a silent, disciplined procession. They moved through the quiet streets of Harmony Creek, not like a gang, but like an army. The rolling thunder had arrived. The house on Willow Creek Lane was exactly as Ghost had described it. A perfect slice of Americana, complete with a manicured lawn, a white picket fence, and a welcoming light on the porch. It was a house that radiated respectability. It was a lie. The iron sentinels did not roar up to the curb. They coasted the last 100 yards, engines cut, rolling to a stop in near silence. It was unnerving, a wave of dark leather and metal washing over the peaceful suburban street. They dismounted, again in disciplined silence. They did not step onto the lawn. They did not block the street. They simply lined the sidewalk on both sides, forming a silent, unbreachable perimeter. They stood by their bikes, arms crossed, their faces impassive. They were statues of judgment. Lights began to flick on in neighboring houses. Faces appeared in windows, drawn by the strange, silent invasion. Bear parked his bike directly across from the house. He stayed seated, his engine off, his eyes fixed on the front door. The SUV with Lily and Doc parked a few houses down, out of the direct line of sight, but close enough to be secure. Inside the house, a light came on in an upstairs window. A silhouette appeared. Marcus Thorne. He looked out, saw the silent army occupying his street, and the silhouette froze. A few minutes later, the front door opened. Thorne stepped out onto the porch. He was a man in his 40s, handsome in a bland, forgettable way. He wore pressed slacks and a cashmere sweater. He was the very picture of a concerned, upstanding citizen. His face was arranged in an expression of mild confusion and polite inquiry. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he called out, his voice smooth and practiced, the voice he used at fundraisers and county meetings. No one answered. The silence was his only reply. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, pregnant with accusation. Thorne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He was a man used to being in control, used to his authority being respected. This silent, collective defiance was something he didn't understand. "Look," he said, his voice a little tighter now. "I don't know what this is about, but this is a private residence. I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call the police." As if on cue, 2 police cruisers turned onto the street, their lights flashing but sirens off. They pulled to a stop at the edge of the bikers' line. A sheriff, a man with a tired face and a paunch, got out of the lead car. He looked at the assembled bikers, his expression wary. He saw Preacher step forward to meet him. "Sheriff Miller," Preacher said calmly, extending a hand. "My name is Jonathan Reed. I'm legal counsel for this citizens group." The sheriff ignored the handshake. "What the hell is this, Reed? You've got half the neighborhood calling 911 thinking the apocalypse has started." "We're holding a peaceful vigil, Sheriff," Preacher said, his tone reasonable and calm. "We have credible reason to believe that a minor residing at this address, one Lily Vance, is in grave danger." "That's ridiculous," the sheriff scoffed. "Marcus Thorne is a pillar of this community. He's one of the good guys." "That's what they always say," Preacher replied, unfazed. He handed the sheriff a file. "This is a sworn affidavit from a witness who saw the child tonight, malnourished, bruised. And this," he added, handing over another set of papers, "is a preliminary analysis of Mr. Thorne's financials, courtesy of our forensic accountant. It shows a clear pattern of embezzlement from the child's trust fund. We also have copies of medical records he falsified, and letters he forged to isolate the child from her next of kin." The sheriff stared at the documents in his hand, his expression shifting from annoyance to uncertainty. From the porch, Thorne watched the exchange, his mask of polite concern beginning to crack. He could see his control of the situation slipping away. He pulled out his phone. "Sheriff," Thorne called out, his voice strained, "I am being harassed by this motorcycle gang. I demand that you arrest them for trespassing and intimidation." The sheriff looked from Thorne to the papers in his hand, and then to the silent, unmoving wall of bikers. He was a small-town cop, out of his depth, but he wasn't a fool. He knew something was deeply wrong here. "Just stay put, Marcus," the sheriff called back, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. He turned to Preacher. "Where is the child now?" "She is safe," Preacher said. "She is in our care, and she will be turned over to the proper authorities as soon as we are certain those authorities are not compromised by personal relationships with the accused." The jab was subtle, but it hit its mark. Just then, the waitress Brenda's car pulled up. She got out, her face pale but determined, and walked straight to the second police officer. "I need to make a statement," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "About the little girl, Lily." This was the tipping point. A local, credible witness. Corroboration. The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. His easy night was over. He walked toward the house. "Marcus, I need to talk to you." Thorne's composure finally broke. "This is insane," he shrieked, his smooth voice turning shrill. "This is my house. You have no right." Bear chose that moment to move. He swung his leg off his bike and began to walk across the street. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, his boots sounding like hammers on the pavement. The other bikers did not move, but their collective gaze followed him, a palpable wave of pressure. He stopped at the edge of the lawn, just outside the picket fence. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a mountain of righteous fury, and stared at Thorne. Thorne's eyes met his. In them, Bear saw not a monster, but a petty, greedy coward. A man who preyed on a child because she was the only one he could dominate. "You," Thorne spat, his finger shaking as he pointed at Bear. "You did this. You filled her head with lies." "No," Bear said, his voice a low growl that carried across the lawn. "She told me the truth, and now everyone is going to hear it." The sheriff and his deputy were on the porch now. "Marcus, we need to come inside. We need to ask you some questions." It was here that Thorne made his fatal mistake. Panicked, cornered, his mask completely gone, he reverted to his true nature. He looked past the sheriff, his eyes wild, and screamed at Bear. "She is my property. The trust, the girl, it all belongs to me. You have no right to interfere with my asset." The word hung in the air. Asset. Property. The sheriff froze. The deputy's hand went to his weapon. Even the neighbors, watching from their windows, recoiled. It was a confession, more damning than any document. It was the unmasking of his soul. Preacher stepped forward. "Sheriff," he said quietly but firmly, "I believe you have probable cause." The sheriff nodded, his face grim. "Marcus Thorne, you are under arrest for suspicion of child endangerment and fraud." The click of the handcuffs was loud in the sudden silence of the street. Thorne didn't fight. He seemed to collapse in on himself, the respectable man vanishing, leaving only a hollow shell. As the police led him to the cruiser, his eyes met Bear's one last time. There was no defiance in them, only the dawning, terrified realization that his carefully constructed world had just been burned to the ground. The bikers watched him being driven away. They didn't cheer, they didn't celebrate, their faces remained grim. This was not a victory, it was a grim necessity, a cancer removed. Saint gave another hand signal. One by one the engines started, a chorus of triumphant roars this time. The job was done. Bear walked back to the SUV. He opened the door. Lily was huddled in the back, Doc sitting quietly beside her. She looked up at Bear, her eyes wide. "Is it over?" she whispered. "It's over," Bear said, his voice thick with emotion. He knelt by the door. "He can't hurt you anymore, I promise." For the first time since he'd met her, Lily's face relaxed. The tension that had held her small body rigid seemed to melt away. And then, she did something that broke his heart and put it back together all at once. She smiled. A small, tentative, watery smile. The legal proceedings were swift. The evidence gathered by Ghost, combined with Lily's diary, the medical reports from Doc's examination, and the testimony from Brenda the waitress, was overwhelming. The town of Harmony Creek was rocked by the scandal. The man they had lauded as a saint was revealed to be a monster. Marcus Thorne was found guilty on all counts: embezzlement, fraud, child abuse, and neglect. The judge, a stern woman with no tolerance for predators, delivered a blistering sentencing statement. She spoke of the sacred trust that had been violated, the cowardice of preying on the vulnerable. She sentenced him to the maximum term allowed by law, ensuring he would be an old man before he ever saw the outside of a prison cell again. The case led to reforms. Lily's law was passed by the state legislature, mandating stricter oversight and independent financial audits for all private guardianship cases involving minors. The system had failed, but now it was being corrected. But for the Iron Sentinels, justice was more than a prison sentence. Ghost investigation had uncovered the location of Lily's grandmother, Eleanor Vance. Thorne had intercepted her letters and calls, telling her that Lily blamed her for her parents' death and wanted no contact. He had told Lily that her grandmother had abandoned her. He had kept them apart, two grieving souls who needed each other, all for the sake of his greed. Bear and Saint drove to the small, tidy home a few states over. When Eleanor, a woman with Lily's clear blue eyes and a face etched with worry, opened the door, Bear simply handed her a photograph of her granddaughter. Tears streamed down her face. Is she all right?" "She's safe," Bear said, "and she needs her grandma." The reunion was a thing of quiet, heartbreaking beauty. Lily, who had been staying in a safe house under the care of Doc's wife, a registered nurse, saw her grandmother and simply fell into her arms. Two broken pieces of a family, finally made whole again. The Iron Sentinels did not just ride away. They had made a promise. They became Lily's unseen guardians, her extended family of leather-clad uncles. They set up a trust fund, the money recovered from Thorne, plus a hefty contribution from the club's national treasury, to ensure she and her grandmother would never have to worry about money again. They paid off Eleanor's mortgage. They filled her pantry. They fixed the leaky roof on her house. They did it all quietly, without fanfare. It was just what they did. 1 year later, the sun was shining on a small backyard filled with colorful balloons. A banner hanging from the porch read, "Happy 10th birthday, Lily." Lily, no longer a ghost, ran across the grass, her laughter bright and clear. She was chasing a puppy, a small golden retriever mix. Her hair was clean and brushed, tied back in a ponytail. She was wearing a bright pink dress. She was, finally, just a kid. Eleanor watched from a porch swing, her face glowing with happiness. A group of large, bearded men stood around a barbecue grill, flipping burgers. They looked out of place in the cheerful suburban setting, but they were completely at ease. It was Bear, Saint, Ghost, Doc, and Preacher. Bear watched Lily, a gentle smile on his face. He looked different today. Still a mountain, but the jagged edges seemed to have been worn smooth. The ghosts in his eyes were quiet. Lily stopped her game of chase and ran to him, throwing her arms around his legs in a fierce hug. "Uncle Bear," she squealed. "Thank you for Samson. He's the best present ever." Bear chuckled, ruffling her hair. The puppy, Samson, had been a gift from the club. "You're welcome, Sunshine." She looked up at him, her blue eyes shining. "Are you going to stay for cake?" "Wouldn't miss it for the world," he rumbled. She beamed, then ran off again, the puppy tumbling at her heels. Saint came and stood beside Bear, holding 2 bottles of water. He handed one to his friend. "She looks good," Saint said. "Happy." "She is," Bear agreed, his gaze following the little girl. "She's healing." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the scene. The quiet peace, the sound of a child's laughter. This was the victory. Not the arrest, not the conviction. This. "You know," Saint said, "that day in the diner, she could have just taken the money. 3 grand would have gotten her a long way from that monster." "I know," Bear said, "but she didn't. She gave it back." Saint took a sip of water. Sometimes the smallest act of honor can change the entire world. Bear nodded, his eyes never leaving Lily. In her, he saw the resilience of the human spirit. He saw the courage it takes to hold on to your goodness in a world that tries to grind it out of you. And he saw the reflection of another little girl, his own Sarah, smiling at him from a place beyond the pain. He hadn't been able to save his own child, but he had saved this one. And in doing so, he had saved a piece of himself. This story is about listening. It's about looking past the surface, past the worn-out clothes and the intimidating leather, and seeing the person underneath. It's about the truth that heroes don't always wear capes or badges. Sometimes they wear leather vests and ride motorcycles. Sometimes they are small, frightened children who refuse to let their spirit be broken. The world is full of wolves dressed in sheep's clothing, hiding behind respectable titles and friendly smiles. But it is also full of bears, silent protectors who stand as a wall between the innocent and the dark. They are the quiet strength, the rolling thunder, the promise that even in the deepest night, help is on the way. And they are there to remind us of one simple, powerful truth. A child's voice, once heard, can be the most powerful weapon in the world.